Master Corps, and their job was to go collect the dead, and they would collect the dead, all of them. That means American, German, civilian. Obviously the primary goal was to collect the American dead. They would collect the dead and they would be placed into temporary cemeteries. They would typically be wrapped in, they had like a mattress cover kind of thing that they would small, simple wooden crosses, and then they would move in, and more cemeteries would be erected. At the end of the war, there was a plan that the U.S. had in motion to give families the option to bring the remains of their loved one home. In World War I, all the dead were buried overseas in cemeteries. Also run by the Battle Monuments Commission. But the plan for repatriation meant that all the dead that were overseas and buried in temporary cemeteries, registered letters were sent to the next of kin giving them three options. The first option was to have the remains returned and buried in a federal cemetery at no expense to the family. The second option was to have the remains returned, and the families could then bury the remains wherever they wished at their own cost. However, they were given a stipend by the government for the burial, which pretty much covered the cost of the burial. The third option was that the remains would remain here and be buried in a permanent American cemetery. The response rate was quite high, and ultimately 60% of our war dead were repatriated to the United States. And the enormity of the process can't be understated. One of the main issues we dealt with was politically, because nobody else had the ability, had the resources to bring their war dead home. And this was particularly true with the British. This British government was aware of our plans to do this, but they didn't want the word to get out to the British people, who would then be upset, because then why couldn't the remains of their loved one be brought back? So we actually had special train cars that had special cases that contained the coffins, and they were taken to the port of Le Havre, where there was an unmarked warehouse. It was typically done at night, but during the whole process, all the caskets were covered in flags. They were always guarded. If they were in a warehouse, they were all continually rendered full military honors during the whole process. They were quietly loaded onto ships, typically at night. When they arrived in the United States, however, it was a very public thing. They would have a ceremony, and the caskets would be brought off the ship, and then they would be dispersed out to the family members. Personal items that would accompany the sets of remains. There was a quartermaster official pouch where you would put the possessions of the deceased, and there were several offices around the United States. In fact, one of them, one of the largest was in Kansas City, and they would receive these pouches, and they had hundreds of people who would go through these pouches, inventory everything, one, to make sure that everything that was listed was still there, but number two, unofficially, they would go through these pouches and remove anything that might be hurtful to the family. Leave that to your imagination. But it was this whole process of wanting to diminish the pain as much as possible for their loss. By the way, so here we are at the Saint Laurent Draw. There's a special memorial here. When the wind goes through, you can stand in there and you can hear this wonderful sound. The official monument is right here, and there's one of these on all the main invasion beaches. Anyway, so the process of bringing back all the war dead was absolutely enormous. It ran up into 1948-49. Most of the permanent cemeteries were officially opened in right around 1960, 62, in that couple of years. Now, the remains that had been that would stay here were typically moved to the permanent cemetery location, like the American Cemetery up here at Colville-sur-Mer had remains. There was a large temporary cemetery outside Saint-Mère-Église, actually on the site which is now the German cemetery, Le Cam, right outside Saint-Mère-Église, the largest German military cemetery outside of Germany. That's where Teddy Roosevelt was buried before his remains are moved up to the American cemetery here. Oh, by the way, that's a Belgian gate, that awful thing at the end there. That's what the Coles paratroopers had to shove aside on that little bridge outside Carentan. What was I saying? Oh yeah. So Teddy Roosevelt is buried here at the American Cemetery. He is buried next to the only other person who there's only one person who did not die in the Normandy campaign or in the Normandy area during World War II, and that's Teddy Jr.'s brother Quentin, who was killed in the First World War. He was an aviator, and the family was able to get Quentin's remains moved and placed right next to his brother Teddy. Now, I will tell you that because this is the most visited American overseas cemetery, and because of the big commemorations